Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. This video that you're watching is intended for students who are enrolled in my class. If you're in someone else's class, learn all the details they want you to know. This video is going to be an introduction for my laboratory to connective tissues. So I'm going to go over connective tissues as much as I can, and then I will show you what the slides look like all in this video. I like to draw them out first so that you can get a good idea in your head of what you should be looking for, and then I'll show you the slides. So, when it comes to connective tissues, now you've probably already watched the videos in lecture for the beginnings of tissues and how we name epithelial tissues. You've watched the laboratory video on epithelial tissues. There's only 4 slides to look at. When it comes to the connective tissues are probably one of the more varied of all the tissue types. What makes one connective tissue different from the other is the type of cells found in the tissue and what makes up the matrix, all the parts that are in between the cells. Kind of like a fish, if you looked at a fish tank, the water and the plants and the little scuba diver guy and everything would be the matrix, and the fish would be the cells, okay? So everything outside the cells that's in the tissue that they live in is called the matrix. The different types of connective tissues are different because of the cell populations found in the tissue and what the matrix looks like, how it appears, okay? So when it comes to connective tissues, this is sort of an introduction that will help also with lecture, but when it comes to connective tissues, there are 3 major types, and all of the connective tissues we look at are some variation of these 3 major types of connective tissue. One of those major types is called connective tissue proper. I'm just going to put CT proper for connective tissue proper. You cannot abbreviate on lab tests except for, well, you can't abbreviate, you have to write it all out. For connective tissue proper, there's going to be 3 subtypes that we look at. There's actually more than that, but right now we're only going to look at 3 subtypes, okay? When it comes to the next type of connective tissue, there's a fluid connective tissue. Fluid connective tissues are very fluid and have a very syrupy or liquid-like matrix, okay? Where connective tissue proper has lots of fibers and cells all mixed in. You'll see what I mean in just a second. Connective tissue proper, there's basically going to be 2 types that we look at. Blood and a fluid called lymph. And we're actually not even going to do fluid connective tissues until we get to part 2A and P, so I'm going to draw a line through them. The third type of connective tissue that we can look at in lab is called supportive connective tissue. Supportive connective tissue has 2 subtypes. There's going to be cartilage and there's going to be bone. I'm going to go into the subtypes in just a moment, okay? So these are the 3 major connective tissues. Connective tissue proper, which has a very fibrous and cellular matrix with lots of syrup in it. It's a very syrupy matrix. Fluid connective tissue, which has cells floating in fluid. And then there's supportive connective tissue. Supportive connective tissue can have a very gel-like matrix, almost like jelly or a foamy kind. It's kind of a squishy matrix. Or it can be very solid, like bone, okay? And we're going to go into the details of this. What I want to do first is I want to cover my connective tissue propers and the different subtypes. And I'm going to draw them out, okay? So when it comes to connective tissue proper, we have 3 subtypes. At least 3 that we're going to look at in lab. There's actually a 4th one we will discuss in lecture. For connective tissue proper, one of those subtypes is going to be called areolar connective tissue. And some people call it loose connective tissue, and some people call it loose areolar connective tissue. This is the term that you should use for the lab, areolar connective tissue. Now, areolar connective tissue is filled with these fibers that are very loosely arranged or scattered. That's why some people call it loose connective tissue. Some of those fibers are going to appear sort of a bright pink color, and they're going to be very thick, okay? And you're going to see these pink-looking fibers running in all different directions through the tissue, all crisscrossing, very loosely arranged. Those thick pink-looking fibers, although this isn't my pink marker, the pink doesn't show up very well, but the thick pink fibers represent a stuff called collagen fibers. or you could simply say collagen. Collagen is made up of a type of protein called collagen, and then these little collagen proteins get strung together. Collagen makes a tissue very strong and durable. It's very hard to rip because of these fibers in the tissue. Also within that tissue, what you will usually notice are some very thin, dark fibers. I'm going to use a black marker, and what you'll see is these very thin, dark fibers running through the tissue. They're very skinny, and they're pretty dark staining, and they also run through the tissue in all these different directions. The thin, dark fibers represent a type of protein fiber, which are called elastic fibers. Elastic fibers are made out of a protein called elastin, and just like elastic in your waistband of your underwear, Fruit of the Loom, Superman waistband, snaps back wash after wash. You ever seen that commercial? But like any elastic, it allows for flexibility. The tissue can be stretched and flexed, and it will snap back. And the fibers are loosely arranged. They're running every direction. Now, in between all these fibers would be this syrupy matrix, sort of a thick viscous fluid flowing in here that we don't see. And then within that viscous fluid, you'll see these little purple nuclei that look like they're floating in the middle of nowhere. Now, technically, every one of these nuclei should have a cell membrane and cytoplasm surrounding it, but they don't always stay in the cell membrane. Sometimes you just see the nucleus floating in there. Roughly, I don't know, somewhere between 75 and 90% of the cells, somewhere around 80-85% of the cells in loose connective tissue or areolar connective tissue are these cells called fibroblasts. There are other cells mixed in, like mast cells and some other cells, but we're not going to be able to see the difference under our microscopes. So for now, if I ask you to ID the cell, it is a fibroblast. Fibroblasts make these protein fibers called collagen and elastin. So, when we look at areolar connective tissue, we see these protein fibers running all different directions. The thick pink fibers are called collagen fibers, a protein that's very strong. The thin dark fibers are elastic fibers, a protein that makes it very flexible. And most of the cells in here are going to be called fibroblasts. So there are 4 questions I could ask you on a lab test. ID the tissue, areolar connective tissue. ID the cell at the pointer, fibroblast. ID the pink fibers, collagen fibers. ID the thin dark fibers, elastic fibers. That's what you should know for this slide, okay? Now I'm going to skip adipose tissue for a second, and I'm going to do dense connective tissue. And when I look at dense connective tissue, which is the second type of these connective tissue propers, there's different types of dense connective tissue. There's dense regular, dense irregular. We're not going to get into the details. Our slides show us this. When we look at dense connective tissue, the fibers can be running vertically or at an angle or across the slide, but essentially, when you look at the tissue, all the fibers are running the exact same direction. And so I'm going to change colors here a little bit because that pink marker is not very good. But you'll see these collagen fibers all running in the exact same direction. There would be some elastic fibers mixed in, but they're few and far between, and they're sandwiched in between the collagen fibers, so we don't see them. So if I ask you to ID the thick pink fibers, they're collagen fibers, the same one as areolar connective tissue. But here they're very loosely arranged. Here they're all very densely and tightly packed together. Provides a lot more strength. And in between those fibers, you'll see these little purple dashes every now and then that represent the nucleus of a cell. Those cells are still called fibroblasts. So for this slide, there's 3 questions I might ask on the lab test. ID the tissue, ID the cell, or ID the pink fibers found in this tissue. The answer would be dense connective tissue, collagen fibers, and fibroblasts. They really are the same stuff, just differently arranged. Now I'm going to erase all this because the third type of connective tissue proper we're going to look at doesn't look like either one of these. Somewhere along their way of developing, some of these fibroblasts decide, I don't want to make fibers, I want to store adipose or fat. So all the fat in your body is a type of connective tissue proper called adipose tissue or adipose connective tissue. So I'm going to erase all this, and then in just a second I'm going to pull the screen down and fire up the projector, and I'm going to show you what slides of these tissues will look like, okay? Excuse me. So the third type of connective tissue proper we can look at is called adipose connective tissue, or some people just say adipose tissue. Adipose connective tissue, before I show you what it really looks like, imagine if I have a cell that has all this pink cytoplasm in it, and that cytoplasm is filled with the organelles, mitochondria, endoplasmic reticulum, and all of that, and in the middle of the cell, we have a nucleus. It's like a typical cell that you look at. Inside these cells, there's a little organelle, a little bubble, that stores adipose, or fat, oil, lipid droplets. As we pack more lipids into that bubble, it's called a lipid vacuole or fat vacuole. As that bubble starts to get larger, it starts to push all the cytoplasm off to the side. And as it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, that lipid vacuole can take up most of the cell, and what we end up with is a very thin wall of cytoplasm, and usually somewhere the nucleus is pushed off to the side. So every adipose cell looks like a big empty cell. They're not empty. You know those rubber bouncy balls that you could buy at Walmart that have nothing but air in them? Imagine if we injected them with Jell-O and then we sliced it open. Well, the walls of the ball would be the cytoplasm, and the Jell-O inside would be adipose tissue, or lipid vacuoles, or lipid bubbles, fat bubbles. And so that organelle gets very large. So when we look at this tissue under a microscope, it's going to look like a bunch of empty pink rings all over the entire slide. Everywhere you look, it's all these cells that are connected to each other that are filled with lipid vacuoles. And so they look like a bunch of hollow, empty cells going all the way across the slide. And occasionally in here, you'll see a little purple nucleus stuck off to the side of a cell. So there's three things I could ask you. Number one is ID the tissue. If it looks like a bunch of pink holes all the way across, it's adipose connective tissue. If I ask you to ID each cell, then the cell is called an adipocyte. And if I ask you to identify the substance or the space inside, it's not really a space, but it's filled with the stuff called a lipid vacuole, because it's filled with lipids. So those are the three questions I could ask. ID the tissue, adipose tissue, or adipose connective tissue. ID the empty space or the fluid inside of here, that would be a lipid vacuole. And then ID the type of cell. Each cell, every one of these rings is a single adipocyte. Okay. Now, knowing all of that, I'm going to pull the screen down. Excuse me while I jump up and grab this. I'm going to step off camera and turn off my lights. And I'm going to show you what this tissue should look like, or all of these tissues. Let the camera fire up for a second. Now, if we were to continue on our slides, this is adipose connective tissue. Quite honestly, it's a very, very densely packed adipose, but you see these thick pink fibers running here, and there's one going across here. All of these thick pink fibers are collagen fibers. All of these skinny dark fibers are elastic fibers, and then those cells are fibroblasts. Okay? So this thick pink thing is a collagen fiber. You see another one running here. There's another one running here. And you see these elastic fibers, and you see the fibroblasts. The type of tissue, areolar tissue or areolar connective tissue. Okay? If I go down or go to the next slide, this is a slide of adipose tissue. It looks like a bunch of empty pink rings. Every one of these rings is an adipocyte. The white stuff inside would be the lipid vacuole, and then you see a little nucleus squeezed off there or there or there. But the three questions would be ID the tissue, adipose tissue, ID the cells found in this tissue, adipocytes, and ID the empty space or the white area inside the cell, fat vacuole or lipid vacuole. Got it? Now, the next slide is going to be what we call dense regular connective tissue or dense connective tissue. All of these pink lines running across are lots of collagen fibers all stuck together, and they make these thick ropes of collagen running across this way. All of the pink things are the fibroblasts. It's the nucleus of a fibroblast. So there's three questions I might ask. ID the tissue that you see on this slide. You would say dense connective tissue. ID the purple cells at the pointer, fibroblasts. ID the thick pink fibers running across this slide. Those would be collagen fibers. So those are your three connective tissue propers. Got it? Now we're going to go into the different cartilages, and I'm going to talk about them in another video. So thanks for watching this one. I hope you understand the connective tissue proper. I hope you know the three subtypes. We will discuss a fourth subtype in lecture, but we're not doing lecture right now. So thanks for watching. I hope you had as much fun as I did. I hope you learned something, and I hope that you work really hard at being able to identify these tissues right off the top of your head. Print them out, look at them, and work your way through them. See you in the next video.